Hello everyone! I recently upgraded the PC I use for sim racing with an RTX 3080 and a Ryzen 5 5600X. There's already a lot of good videos benchmarking these components around, but not so many focusing on Assetto Corsa Competizione and even less in VR. Here, I wanted to share with you how much of an improvement this new hardware brings over my previous configuration. I'm also in the process of upgrading my VR headset for an HP Reverb G2 that is currently on pre-order, but that will be for another video. The PC I used with ACC for a few years was based on a Ryzen 5 2600, 16 gigs of RAM and a factory overclocked GTX 1080 Ti. I now switched to a Ryzen 5 5600X, slightly faster RAM and an RTX 3080. But in this video, I'd like to detail separately how the CPU and the GPU upgrades affect the performance in ACC in VR. Then, I will also include benchmark results of the Ryzen 5 2600 with the RTX 3080 and the Ryzen 5 5600X with the GTX 1080 Ti. As for the VR headset, I will use the Oculus Rift CV1. In this video, I will show you the results of benchmarks in 3 different game modes: practice session, single-player race with AIs, and online multiplayer race. I evaluated each mode with the 3 video presets offered by Kuno Simulazioni: VR Low, VR High, and VR Epic. All of these combinations were tested on the 4 different hardware configurations. For the practice session, I recorded a single lap from the pit to the finish line. For the single-player race, I chose to start last after 5 AIs, follow the group, and only pass the car in front of me when it cannot keep up with the others. Only the first lap was recorded. For the multiplayer race, I didn't qualify to make sure to be placed somewhere at the back of the grid. First, I recorded the rolling start and the first lap using the VR Epic preset. I will show you the results of this specific lap at the end of the video. Then I recorded regular laps, going back to the pit and changing video settings on each lap. Because these laps are more comparable to each other and represent a more nominal case than the race start, these are the ones I will use when comparing results between different game modes. All of these tests were done on the Nürburgring circuit under normal weather conditions. Now let's go to the test results. First with the Ryzen 5 2600 and the GTX 1080 Ti. This configuration can sustain 90 FPS with a video preset of VR High or less. But this is alone on the track. With 5 AIs, no video setting is able to sustain 90 FPS, and it's even worse in multiplayer. Basically, with the Ryzen 5 2600 and the GTX 1080 Ti, you'll have the best results by locking a synchronous pace warp to 45 FPS and not using too demanding video settings to assure a stable frame rate. By only replacing the GPU for the RTX 3080, we can now maintain 90 FPS in a practice session and raise the frame rate over 60 FPS in a single player and multiplayer race. Which means it's still better to lock to 45 FPS with ASW, but there is some headroom that could be used to increase video setting. We can already see that there is not a big difference between the 2 GPUs. This is because the Ryzen 5 2600 bottlenecks and limits the GPU processing power that can be used. This is not easy to spot when directly looking at CPU graphs, but it becomes obvious when looking at maximum GPU usage statistics. None of the combinations I tested is able to max out the GPU usage. In the case of the 1080 Ti, it is actually possible to benefit from the remaining processing power by increasing video setting. But with the 3080, a lot of the processing power will definitely go to waste. Since the Ryzen 5 2600 is clearly the limiting factor, let's see what both GPUs are really capable of with a much better CPU. Starting with the GTX 1080 Ti, results are already quite impressive. When the CPU doesn't bottleneck, the 1080 Ti is able to sustain 90 FPS in all tested game modes up to the VR High preset. Even the VR Epic preset gives some really good results. It's not 90 FPS, but 45 FPS is really acceptable with good graphic settings and super sampling. So now, What happens when we combine this very good 5600X and the RTX 3080 together? Results are pretty self-explanatory. This hardware configuration can sustain 90 FPS in a practice session, in a race with 5 AIs, and in a multiplayer race with 20 drivers. And this up to the VR Epic preset. But wait, that's not the whole story yet. All multiplayer results I presented until now were nominal cases based on measures from the middle of a race. The most challenging moment for the hardware is actually the race starts and the first few corners. So I measured the very first lap of multiplayer races in all 4 hardware configurations, with the VR Epic preset to make it even more challenging. The results are very clear. The Ryzen 5 2600 with the GTX 1080 Ti cannot reach 45 FPS on the starting grid and barely maintain it after the first few corners. The RTX 3080 doesn't help the Ryzen 5 2600 much with so many cars around. The Ryzen 5 5600X with the aging GTX 1080 Ti can easily sustain 45 FPS with ASW enabled and provide some good headroom. And finally the Ryzen 5 5600X with the RTX 3080. This configuration can maintain 90 FPS almost all the time. Yes, there are a few spikes down to 85 FPS and 1 to 74 FPS, but looking at other statistics I recorded, these look like they are caused by some unrelated event. These spikes match a strange activity I had on my CPU at the exact same moment. Since the 5600X and the 3080 combo is able to reach and sustain the 90 FPS target, what becomes more interesting now than the frame rate is the amount of headroom that is left. With the VR Low preset, the GPU usage reached a maximum of 39%. With the VR High preset, the GPU usage reached a maximum of 49%. And with the VR Epic preset, the GPU usage reached a maximum of 88%. But to be honest, many settings in the VR Epic preset are totally overkill. With the Oculus Rift CV1, you will get a much better clarity by starting with the VR High preset and taking advantage of the 51% of headroom to customize a few significant settings and push super sampling as high as you can. Tell me in the comments if you are interested in a video on how to get the most out of your VR headset with ACC. And what about the CPU headroom? CPU usage is more difficult to interpret, mainly because of hyperthreading. The most simple yet meaningful graph I could make is the maximum usage of any thread over the first lap of a multiplayer race with the VR Epic preset, and the peak usage in this situation is 85%. So what did we learn from all these test results? Clearly, Assetto Corsa Competizione requires a good CPU. Only then it is able to benefit from a powerful GPU. A Ryzen 5 2600 is not enough, but a Ryzen 5 5600X is perfectly sufficient. On the GPU side, a good old GTX 1080 Ti is sufficient enough to lock 90 FPS if you pair it with a more recent CPU and if you are ready to make compromises on graphics settings. Alternatively, you can lock a synchronous space warp to 45 FPS and use the GPU processing power this gives back to you for great settings and super sampling. Finally, the association of the new Ryzen 5 5600X and RTX 3080 showed that 90 FPS can finally be locked in ACC in VR, even in the most demanding situations and with amazing graphics settings. It is finally possible to get the most out of the Oculus Rift CV1. The new question now is how will this perform with a more recent VR headset? It actually needed 2020 hardware to be able to get the most out of a 2016 VR headset in Assetto Corsa Competizione. So what will happen with a higher resolution headset? Will super sampling become useless and the current generation of hardware will be able to keep up? Or will it be limited until future generations of CPUs and GPUs come by? I hope I will be able to answer that question as soon as I receive the HP Reverb I have on pre-order. You may want to subscribe to notifications if you are interested in this VR headset as well. Also, feel free to comment about what other tests and videos you'd like to see here in the meantime. on this. See you next time.